So now we will go to our members, and we will start with Seery Kearney. So,
thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to everyone who has contributed this morning. I have read your opening statements with great interest. I suppose through the filter of the Children's Committee publishing the Assessment of Needs report this week also, and constantly asking the question of how much of the gaps here are to do with the data that was available in planning, and that planning needs to go back to subjects taken in secondary school, options for college, the number of places in college, the appropriateness of courses in college, and then moving on to employment and the provision of services. And so almost the data needs to be so many years ahead of actual provision in order to meet provision. So who's born and when they're born, and gathering that information as quickly as possible post-birth or even pre-birth is really important. So I suppose in that, my question leads to thresholds. So the threshold on which a person includes themselves into questions asked or not, do we feel they're refined enough? You know, so I look at the CSO, the census questioning, and questions 15 and 16 from the most recent census, and think, I wonder how many people will include themselves into, you know, the physical activity question or not, or exclude themselves, not see that as being relevant to them, or explain themselves in age, or, you know, unfitness, or you know, there are a number of things whereby I worry about, even where we go after looking more qualitative data, how do we get it? You know, I've reached the age I am. Nobody's ever surveyed me for anything like that, or anyone that I know in actual fact. So who are we asking the questions of? How do we know that they're appropriately including themselves in that, or excluding themselves? So then when we are looking at disaggregation, how do we know we're asking the right question? I don't know, perhaps that's very rudimentary to everybody else here. You know, some of the questions asked by my colleagues on this committee, but it's just being down to the fundamental of how do we move from quantitative, and even the quantitative I would challenge, because we have a lot of people who apply for disability benefits every year and who are refused. They believe they should be included, but they're not. So for relying on those statistics, then the Department of Social Protection is missing people who believe they should be included. You know, and I think of people that are amputees who don't meet that medical certificate threshold by having, you know, by only having one limb amputated, and consequently they're excluded from a whole heap of, they don't. I know one individual who's gone her whole lifetime and never gotten any support from the state. So I suppose in it, I'm questioning. You know, I fear that we're asking the right questions, that we aren't delving deep enough. I fear the lack of planning because we don't have the information, and how do we overcome that? And then I also think about HSE and a medical model that, despite the movements, it still seems to be entrenched quite often in a medical model, and so how does that influence the social needs and the living ordinary lives needs that people need? Anyway, apologies, it's beginning to become a soapbox. So I'll over to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Who wants to start? Cormac?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I might answer from the perspective of the census questions. So the principle in how most census questions are designed is that CSO engages with the users. So in terms of question 15 and 16 that were mentioned there for the last census form, the process is that the CSO appoints a census advisory groups, which is a representative group of subject matter experts across the board. And as I mentioned during the opening statement, the NDA and our colleagues in IREC were also part of that census advisory group in 2016. The census advisory group in 2016 took the decision to appoint a subgroup to look particularly at the disability questions. So there was a number of subject matter experts around that group, and like every census question, there's a balance to be struck about meeting user needs, about making sure that the questions are understandable and comprehensible. You can't put overly complex questions on a census form, because we know from experience if you do that, the questions won't be well answered and the data will suffer ultimately. There's also another tension whereby if you change a census question too much from one census to another, you compromise the comparability of the data. So these are the kind of discussions that were had at that disability subgroup the last time around. And I'd say that the CSO views itself as the custodian of the census, not the owner of the census. The census questions are very much owned by the users of that data. So the CSO is very much reliant on the key stakeholders, the subject matter experts in, for example, the area of disability. So we're very much guided by what their needs are. They're the ones that use the data, that need the data. So our key concern in these discussions is to maintain the statistical integrity of the census and make sure the questions, as I said, are as comprehensible and as useful as possible to produce good quality data. So for the consultation leading into the last census, the questions were changed significantly in response to user requirements during that subgroup. As I said, the Washington group framing of census questions was integrated into the questions to a great extent, not to a full extent, because the users also wanted to maintain as much comparability with the Census 2016 questions as possible. So that's kind of a little bit of that tension that I mentioned. So ultimately, the subgroup on disability signed off on the framing of the questions. There were some changes as well to some of the wording of the categories and the instruction in question 16 to include issues due to old age. Those proposals were brought back to the plenary, if you like, Census Advisory Group, which approved the subgroup's recommendations, and that ultimately was approved by government in 2019 ahead of the census. So that's how it works. CSO doesn't really come in with any agenda into these discussions. It's really to try and meet the user's needs as much as possible, subject to those constraints and other kind of broader constraints such as space. I think from a statistician's perspective, we'd love to have hundreds of questions in the census form, but we've got a responsibility to the public to minimise the response burden. And we know that, again, if there are too many questions in the census form, the response rate tends to suffer. So it's about trying to meet all these needs and balance them to the greatest extent possible. And we delivered those questions, which are a significant change. We fully processed the census now, and we're at the point where we're ready to produce the results starting from May. We think there's going to be very good data, very interesting data to produce from that. And one of the big benefits of the census is that we can really disaggregate the data down to small area level, which is neighbourhood statistics down to around 100 households. So, down to your housing estate, your townland, your street. So we can meet that requirement for disaggregation to a great extent. And looking forward then to potential changes to these questions going forward for 2027, effectively the same process will apply. A census advisory group will be appointed. I won't create any hostages to fortune and say that whether there will be a disability subgroup appointed, but that will be the decision of the census advisory group when it meets, and we anticipate that meeting the first meeting will be in June, and that subgroup will contemplate the questions if it's formed, and it'll decide whether those questions that were posed in 2022 are appropriate. And again, the CSO will be very reliant on user guidance, the users of the data, the people who rely on the data to help us frame the questions. If there are to be changes, the CSO has no skin in the game other than ensuring that the statistical integrity and the questions are suitable for a census are adhered to. So that's what the process will be like. It's very much driven by the users. I can't create any hostages to fortune about what the content of the 2027 questionnaire will be, but I personally think it'd be very unlikely that there'd be any diminution in the amount of disability questions. They're extremely important questions, and I think that's reflected in the fact that there is a dedicated publication coming out in disability. There are other parts of the census form where there isn't a dedicated publication, which other users might have an opinion on, but that's the importance, I think, of the disability statistics that we recognise from a census perspective.
Thanks, Cormac. Amy?
So just to follow up on a couple of things in relation to the Senator's questions. I think this question of how do people, know when to identify themselves as disabled is a really difficult and complex one. And it's one that we actually spend an awful lot of time in Disabled Women Ireland and in the DPO network talking about, because there can be a significant barrier to people feeling comfortable in identifying as disabled. And we can talk about, I could literally talk for 15 minutes about why that is the case, but the different barriers, the stereotypes, attitudes, and the need for kind of, changing public perception around disability and framing it not necessarily as an inherently negative thing. And all of that kind of feeds into the bigger picture of why it can be very difficult for people to describe themselves as disabled or to identify themselves as having difficulties in various different areas. And so when we're thinking about sort of the context of disability proofing and the SDGs, I think all of that kind of it's all part of the same soup, right? It all fits together. And we can't really tackle one without tackling other aspects of it. I will say that we did have problems with the most recent census in that it didn't necessarily capture autistic individuals. We have no idea of how many wheelchair users there are in the country. So even when the census results come out, and we are looking forward to it, there are certainly going to be limitations in terms of how we can use that data effectively in our advocacy. So, this issue is by no means sorted, and it's something that we have to look to the future. We need to make sure that, that data is produced in a way that is accessible to various different individuals. That was an issue that we had with the last census. But I think, ensuring that the data is accessible and coupling it to sort of awareness raising and changing public perception around disability is going to be a really important part of ensuring that we're capturing disabled people and, creating a situation where people are comfortable in identifying as disabled, because most certainly the numbers are going to be underrepresented. Most certainly the true number of disabled people in the country will not be reflected in the census, and that's always going to be the case, and that's most certainly a change that we're seeing over time. But I think we have to push on all sides in order to make it more accurate and more reflective of the population.
Okay, Jackie?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, following on from what the others have said, Senator Kearney's question is a really good question, but I think we should be very clear the differences in terms of trying to define disability, if you like, and trying to have a one catch-all definition of disability for everything is not going to work. There is a different, and you spoke, for example, you were talking about people not qualifying for different schemes or grants or benefits and things like that. Those are based on qualifiers known generally as qualifying criteria, and they certainly need to be reviewed for sure. But that is different to trying to estimate and disaggregate the entire population of disabled people. And I think if we're really talking about trying to do that, we have to start right back at the human rights approach to disability, a social model of understanding, where we're actually looking at if we accept that as our premise, but then in order to understand and try and capture, as Amy was trying to explain very well, that to capture as many people as we may possibly do in any sense, we then need to say, well, identify what are the 20, 30 barriers broadly facing the broad church of disabled people, because as Amy and others have said, is the population of disabled people is hugely diverse. So, and I absolutely appreciate the challenge that the CSOs face in trying to develop appropriate questions. And you referenced, I worked with him many years ago on a disability survey, national disability survey study, and maybe it's time for a discrete national disability survey following the report of this census. I think it would be very timely in the context of implementing the convention in Ireland, very timely in relation to the development and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals before 2030. So maybe that's something else that could be thrown out there for consideration, that it does warrant our issues, and the assessment of needs you referenced, Senator, we all know that assessment of needs under the Disability Act is in itself wholly inappropriate. It doesn't actually really do anything for the rights of disabled people. All it does is identify needs. It doesn't identify or establish rights to any services that might be required based on that assessment. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more, Jackie.
Nim Kearns, had you your hand raised?
Yes, thank you. Most of my comments have actually been covered now, but I just wanted to just touch on a couple of points. First of all, is to acknowledge that the Irish figure for disability is 13.5, which is far, in our census data, which is far, far below the EU average. For comparison, Northern Ireland, it's 21.7%, and it's difficult to see any significant social factors that would account for that difference, except for gaps in data collection. Disabled Women Ireland held a series of consultations on the CRPD to inform the DPO Network Shadow Report. And in the weeks coming up to it, our inbox and my phone were blown up by people calling because, due to the language we used to invite participants, they had registered and then panicked, basically, because they didn't know if they were allowed to identify or if they counted as disabled. And every single person I spoke to did. However, none of them would have filled out the census or be captured in any other system as disabled, because the definitions used did not reflect their lives, and also because of this confusion socially we have on what or what does not count as disabled. Personally, I have a lifelong disability that no longer counts as disabled under any Irish regulations after the age of 18. I also have never qualified. I'm disabled in 6 different ways. I have never qualified for any state support. So we are missing crucial data, and it also, so we have to address this both ways, the kind of the factors that Amy was speaking to, but also just the general misconception and lack of understanding, even among disabled people, of who counts and who we are counting. I'm delighted to hear that the CSO is adopting the web accessibility to make the statistics, the census, and I hope also the statistics gathered from the census accessible. It would be great to clarify whether that's going to be retrospective in any way. The 2011 census results are accessible to screen reader users, however the 2016 results are not. So for people working in our organisation who use screen readers, they can't access that data, they can't do their jobs, so it would be great to